Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. Xi Jinping proclaimed a new era for China in last month's Communist Party Congress, an era, in his words, that sees China moving closer to center stage and making greater contributions to mankind. While hailing China's model, Xi said it is a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. This contradicts conventional modernization theories, which assume modernization's equation with westernization. As multiple modernities rise, new questions loom in. And to answer those questions, we are joined by Thomas Meyer, a senior professor of political science at Dortmund University in Germany, and also here in the SAR in the Institute of European Studies of Macau. Professor Thomas Meyer, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the show. Is China becoming an alternative model to the one which is basically Western-centric?
If we accept in the beginning that all these models are in change all the time, it's never anything fixed for the rest of the time, then I think it is about to be for a certain time, couple of decades, maybe one or two, a model for some other countries too, and particularly also a model for itself. So there will be a clear understanding within China also that this is the way they pursue the next 10 years or so. And the Europeans, particularly the Americans, they also have to understand that China has the right to determine its own way of modernization. And since long, political science, also in politics to a degree, we have understood that the old ideas from the 1950s and 60s, maybe even 70s, that the Western way of modernization is the only role model of modernization, is now not accepted anymore. It is it is to be relativized. It is a model that is itself in crisis in a way, as we see in the United States, to a degree also in Europe. So we have to accept for a variety of reasons, a broad variety of reasons, that each country is able and has the right to choose its own path of modernization. But in order to be a modern country which can claim to pursue the path of modernization, it also needs to meet certain criteria.
Such as?
This is the question, because modernization is a term that has some normative implications. Not everybody can say we are a modernizing country. If North Korea would say we are a modernizing country, or this is our way of modernization, this would not be accepted by anybody. So therefore the criteria, the consensus among all the alternatives, the alternative ways of modernization, is a topic. This is one of the topics we discuss here. We had this very rich seminar at the Institute of European Studies
this month.
And last week with scholars from the United States, from Europe, from China, from Macau. We also had invited people from South America, which could not come due to personal reasons, unfortunately. And the question is, what is the common core? What is the consensus all those countries who claim to be on a way of modernizations must stick to, must fulfill? The preliminary answer is that you say this is something we also have to negotiate between the different protagonists of different ways of modernization. What is the common core? We have a proposal to make. This is something that we discussed there, so we can come to this. We have a certain understanding what the minimal criteria are that every country, every culture must fulfill to rightfully claim we are on a way of modernization our own way, but still modernizing, become more and more modern. And we can come to this. We have a clear idea what the minimum standards, the minimum consensus for this would be. And we are in a discussion with people from China, other people, and we hope to come to a certain conclusion.
The path towards modernization is in itself, to some extent as well, a source of legitimacy In the case of China, it is for sure. What about the issue of course, which would be intertwined to some extent, of delivering adequately public goods? Is it also part of being modern?
So our proposal, the Western proposal, you could say, and I think they accept it more or less, we are still in discussion, is the minimum standard is good governance, according the idea of good governance as it has been formulated by the United Nations also, good governance. So if you do not pursue the path of good governance, like the Koreans, then it's clearly not modernization what they are doing, it's just anti-modern what they are doing. And the criterion of good governance is described as follows. There must be a broad or a full inclusion of everybody in the process of determining the politics, the policies of these countries, participation, the input side, the participation side, inclusion. So everybody must have an opportunity to bring in his or her own input, and there must be a full or more or less full inclusion in the output side, in the distribution and production of goods, private goods, public goods. So if this is there, there's of course a interrelation between the two parts of government, of governance. If there is this full inclusion, participation and outcome, then the question is how you organize, according to the traditions of your own country, according to the culture of the people, the special institutions that ensure, that make sure that this inclusion is there. But the main thing is inclusive government as contrary to exclusive government.
So we're talking about focusing on governance and not necessarily on a political system that would be a sort of one-size-fits-all. The point is,
this
we're
was
not talking
the
about
old Western prejudice that modernization means just the export of Western institutions. But this is certainly a big mistake, because what we also realized is when the process of decolonization took speed in the late 40s, early 1950s, some of the erstwhile imperial powers, the colonial powers, like France, maybe like Portugal, like Great Britain, let their colonies free to determine their own fate there. They nonetheless exported their institutions there, and then the main experience was the institutions were there, they were introduced to get the support from the colonial powers and all this, the cooperation. But the institutions played a very different role, very different from what they played in the home countries. So the culture of these countries changed the game of the political institutions. And what appeared from the outside as a Western model, from the inside was something completely different. It was something according to the logic of the culture, of the indigenous culture of these countries. And therefore, it is neither effective nor meaningful nor legitimate.
And may create a backlash against the very own concept of democracy.
Yeah.
May give a bad name to it. Would that be the case in some situations?
Yeah, but I mean, you cannot just export the institutions. You should say, okay, participation, participation, inclusive participation. And the way this is done has to do something with the cultural traditions. And this can be determined by these countries themselves. Still, the criterion is there. And you can measure each set of institutions by this criterion. For instance, if you go to the United States and ask, is this an inclusive democratic system? The answer would be definitely partly, but by far not fully. So these institutions are there, but the inclusion is not there. So this is, I think, an interesting criterion of good governance that can be applied both in the East and in the West, but is something that links all the different paths, all the different modes, varieties of modernization in a way together. There is a consensus.
So there's no high ground, there's no moral high ground here. And you're suggesting moving towards a level playing field.
There is also a moral high ground, but the moral high ground
doesn't belong to the West necessarily, or to
may be defined in different ways. For instance, if you look into Confucianism, you will find that there's a very clear definition of dignity, of human dignity, and there are very, very detailed and clear prescriptions what needs to be done by a government, by other people, to respect the dignity of a person. So the concept of dignity is also what is behind the Western understanding of basic rights, of democracy and all this, in the sense of the Enlightenment. So these are the basic values, very, very demanding values, very aspirational values. They should play a role in all the ways of modernization. If you do not try to accept and translate these basic values into practice, you cannot claim to be modern in a way. You can be modern in a technical sense, but when we say modernization, we have a more comprehensive understanding of the term. And this is an interesting discussion with the Chinese, for instance, because this is something they understand, they can understand. And this is something which gives both sides an opportunity to ask for the legitimization of the other side. So how do you cater to the dignity of everybody here and there? This is a good platform, even for a normative discussion, without being imperialistic in the sense that you say, our model is the true model, and if you don't accept it, you are wrong.
So a certain approach to human dignity, for instance, or to governance would be the common ground, and then from here on, there would be multiple approaches in terms of institution building and the way the edifice is comes into fruition for a modern project, right? So that is a point that you are making in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, we started from in modern Europe, we started from the idea of human dignity, of each individual person. And finally, we landed at the idea of basic rights. Basic rights are a protection belt for human dignity. All the basic rights. The civil basic rights, the political basic rights, the social basic rights, and the economic basic rights. This again is the idea that you have to be inclusive government on both ends of the political process. The input, participation, these are the liberal and the political basic rights, and the output. These are the social and the economic basic rights. That means distributions of goods, public goods, individual goods. This means good life, good infrastructure, education, and all this. These are the things that are also, to a degree, measured by the Human Development Index of the United Nations. So these are the things that matter, and not the institutional things at the surface of matter.
You mentioned input and output. So let's say, for instance, in some cases, for example, in China, in terms of input and participation, there's still a long way to go, but in terms of output, it is considerable and remarkable what was achieved, some would say, and many would recognize and stress that. On the other hand, you have cases where you have apparently a satisfactory input in terms of participation, but problems in terms of output.
So, good governance means that a political system is good in both, sufficiently good. Participation and output, good. Public goods and private goods. If there's only a lot of participation and no output, then there's something wrong with the political system. That means somehow the institutions or the governing people eat up. Sometimes it only looks as if there is a good input, because elections alone do not assure that the input is effective. There must be many more other things. The system of media, the education of people, the party system, the role of money. So there are countries with big elections and electoral campaigns that last half a year, very noisy and everything. And then in the end, it's mainly the money that rules the country. So these things play a role. We must analyze this. And in the output, of course, there are some countries also in which participation is quite good, but for some reasons the outcome, social goods, public goods that make a good living or make people, help people to conduct a good life. So these are the things that really matter. We must look at this. And there are instruments in political science, in the political arena, some newspapers even, like The Economist, they developed their own democracy model, which is good already. There they say we must make more differences. We must say, okay, there are strong democracies, there are defect democracies, there are hybrid systems, there are benign authoritarian systems, there are malign authoritarian systems. This is the kind of differentiation that you have to make, and then you must see in what stage of modernization is a country. Because in some countries, they have to tackle at the same time many different problems. For instance, in Europe, it took us 200 years. 200 years to start with the state of law, introducing good legal systems, industrialization, and then democratization partly, and after this, the welfare state, stepwise. The sequence was very well formed, distinct stages. Here in these countries, let's say even China, they have to do everything at the same time. And then they are expected to reach the same level of modernization as the West in
40 years,
10 years, on 15 years. So this is not reasonable. You can demand this, but you cannot understand things if you do this. It's simply a question of understanding what is the case and how things develop and how things matter. Because in these countries, not only China, we take China because we are here in China, they have to create a nation. China was a civilization with many national minorities in it. It's a civilization state, as some people say. They have to create a nation. At the same time, they have to create a stable order, how these things fit together. Then they have to create a legal system that makes this order fair and acceptable for everybody. Then they, at the same time, are expected and need to deliver an efficient economic system that satisfies the needs of the people. And then in addition to all this, they're expected to create a sufficient and acceptable system of political participation. And this all at the same time, simultaneously. And of course, then they have to make a choice sometimes. What is now the priority in this moment? And then the priority might change in the next moment. So this is to be understood.
But do you share the concerns of those who are worried that under the current leadership, in some ways or in some aspects, things moved backwards in terms of individual rights, human rights lawyers, oppression of the state?
I understand and share these concerns, of course. I think I've been traveling to China since 35 years, maybe.
You've seen a lot of transformations.
Always dialogues with relevant people and looking around. So I saw for a certain period, let's say since 78, Deng Xiaoping's policy of opening, there was an increasing opening of the country, internal opening, civil society activities, pluralism in the universities, pluralism to a certain degree in the internet, and also the freedoms, the liberties of citizens increasing, and all this. And it seemed also that there is an increasing rule of law, impartial. And now the politics of the awakening of China, the great dream of China, so to a certain degree means an internal closing. One ideology, again, one common ideology, and also a more restrictive way of keeping the internal order, controlling ideas and discussions. There seems to be a certain closing, which it is, indeed, and the justification is, of course, to do away with certain problems, overcome certain problems, like the big problem of corruption, like the big problem of a lack of motivation of party functionaries and officials, like the lack of discipline in public life and all these problems that are there. Whether this is the best way to overcome these problems is another question. But then the vision of Xi Jinping in making China a country of modest wealth for everybody, which is also a basic rights, social and economic basic rights, seems to be successful. And in particular, what we appreciate most, and therefore we think we should understand and cooperate China in that sense unconditionally, is that China wishes to play a positive, constructive role in the international arena by supporting
Climate, in terms of tackling climate change and environmental issues.
Multilateral governance, a multilateral international political order. They even one of the professors here from Beijing said, international democracy. They are now hesitant to use the term democracy for their internal relations.
But in terms of external relations?
Which they used. But for the external, they use it. So Professor Jin Yajing, leading expert and advisor in international politics, used the term global democracy, which was used before also in the Chinese discussion, which means this should really be a multilateral type of governance that China wishes to establish and supports. And I think this is credible. And this is a major contribution to the welfare of the whole world, to peace, to mutual understanding. And then in this framework, there must be sufficient leeway for different countries to develop according to their own ideas of modernization and welfare.
And at the same time, we have China's approach to its core interests, let's say, for instance, in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, which this happens at the same time while China is also launching the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you regard this situation?
Yeah, this is in a sense it is ambivalent. In a certain sense, it is ambivalent because it's clear there are, with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, these are clear positive aspects, positive results. They create a international infrastructure. That's an infrastructure program, and the benefiters of this are all the countries along the road, along the belt, and this is something, this is good. This is in the interest of many. This is multilateral, if you wish. At the same time, also, of course, this increases China's influence. They would not have a control over this road or belt in the formal sense that they are the masters of it and decide who can use it and this and this and this, or reign in the politics and situation of other countries. But of course, this increases their soft power tremendously and also their economic power. So, but this is something, this is quite natural. The question only is, in which way is the software and the economic power used that it is created by this? For instance, when they buy enterprises in European countries, in which way is this used? So therefore, this is why the European countries also control which industries, to what degree, can be owned by countries like China. But China has been forced in the last decades up till now to be very, very modest because the ruling powers in the world, the dominant powers, were very, very dominant and aggressive and loud and noisy. So now if China claims...
China's being more assertive now,
yeah,
in some ways.
Now it's much more assertive and it claims to be given the proper part of the cake, which it deserves. Then some people say, no, they are not modest enough anymore. So to a certain degree, they must be more assertive because their weight in the world is much bigger than it was. The question only is, in what way do they make use of this weight in the long way? And
there's also a risk of a sort of backlash in terms of perceptions, narratives and perceptions in many other ways of a sort of narrative of new imperialism and rising China as the new pole vis-à-vis the United States.
You are right, but if the old imperialists say, no, this is new imperialism, this is not very credible. They have played the game in a very, very rude and awful manner, hundreds of years.
As colonial masters.
And now, when there are certain ambivalent aspects in China's international or development policies, they say this is new imperialism. This is really not credible. And there are these aspects. They are always there. If you help other people or if you invest, if you are dominant economically, this always has this touch and the opportunity a little bit. But I would not say that this is a dominant feature in Chinese politics.
Is China truly becoming a good citizen of international organizations?
Hopefully, it can. I think that the proclamation by Xi Jinping and by other leading Chinese figures, even scholars, who say, we just want our part of the cake here, and we play our role, and we offer you our degree, our measure of responsibility and participation. This is okay. There is no problem. Contrarily, this is desirable, very much desirable. And whether they feel tempted to make a wrong use of this is unclear, but I would not say from the very beginning they are determined to misuse these new powers.
And they're filling in a sort of vacuum which is being left by the United States. Would you agree?
Of course.
Especially with the current Trump administration?
I mean, the basic situation is they could not have any better and more forceful help than the Trump presidency. Trump is weakening the United Nations. He's deepening the internal split between two cultures in the United States, and he is incredible. And of course, he proclaimed that the only interest America has in the world arena is egoism, fulfill its own interests. And then in this situation, the promise of Xi Jinping to say, we want to play a constructive role, ecology, world climate, world infrastructure, and all these things, terrorism. This gives him a wonderful opportunity. And most people say, this is desirable, very good.
Is there still such thing as the West? Because we started by mentioning the West. What is the West?
I would say the West is a problematic term. I used to implement the term modernity or modern times all the time because the real West, as it existed in the Middle Ages, the Roman West, so to say, the Christian West, was something else. It was neither a democracy nor a place where basic rights played an important role, not pluralistic, not liberal, nothing. So the new time after Enlightenment is the modern time. Therefore, for me, for us, the term modernity, modern culture, modernization is a very important time. The West, in the sense that there is an axis of shared values and shared global responsibility or shared strategies between the US and Europe, is at least very, very much weakened. And the idea that this is a unit, the US and Europe, is not true anymore. These times are over. Now we struggle for a minimum also with them of consensus. We are in the same situation, so to say, as with other countries. We see what is the remaining basic consensus between the United States and Europe. Because in so many very important questions, we have a dissent. We have a dissent in what we understand by democracy. For the Americans, democracy is libertarian democracy, the market and the elections. For us, democracy is social democracy, not only elections, pluralism, but also social citizenship and all this. So different ideas. And then we have the idea as a global power, soft power, the European Union, we have a global responsibility, and we want to take on this responsibility. The US declared we don't have a global responsibility, we have only the responsibility to serve ourselves. So what is the remaining consensus here, free trade and all this. This is still in a process of being worked out, of being clarified. It's still not clear. So the West, in any demanding sense, in any strong sense, I think, it does not exist. But modernity, modern culture, exists in Europe, but Europe also is under stress momentarily.
And I would wrap up our talk by talking about Europe and Western Europe, now that we mentioned West. This is because Western Europe is in the midst of a number of complex challenges, geographically coming from the east, from the south, from the west in the United States. And this juncture is particularly challenging.
Yeah.
As someone who I would say is a pro-Europeanist, as yourself, heavily, what can we say about your faith in the fate of Europe, the European Union? I mean,
my answer will consist of two parts. The first, I never would give up, and my friends, my political friends, never would give up the idea of a united Europe. I belong to a party,
the Social Democratic Party, Germany,
that in its party program of 1925 wrote, "We are fighting for the United States of Europe." And ever since, this was our main idea. So if the present experiment of the European Union would fail, I don't hope, and I don't think it will, this still would not nullify the idea of a unified Europe. So we still had to continue for a fresh start. So this is one thing. The other thing is the multiplicity of crises of the European Union that we experience presently is unprecedented. Because, as you said, we have these East European countries that engage more and more in identity politics. We, our national identity against the West, even the party systems, more and more are following this. Anti-immigrants, anti-liberalism, and they even boast themselves of being anti-liberal, like the Hungarians. We have the refugee crisis. There's no clear answer to this, because if the refugees keep coming in the same measure as they did during the last years, Europe, the European Union, could not afford this, could not manage this. This is my opinion. We could discuss this, but I think it's not the place here. And then, of course, we have the Brexit. The Brexit might give some agitators an example, a model, how to make politics in certain countries. And of course, we still have the Euro crisis, which is not settled. So we need a fresh start. And I think the ideas of Macron, French president, have been a good starting point for this. And all the other governments are very well advised to take this up and come to a common support of this, or in a modified way, I don't know. But this is the right way of rejuvenating the European Union.
And with this, and I think I would say it's a rather optimist tone in a challenging situation, we finish our talk. Professor Thomas Meyer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you on the show for such a fascinating talk. And to you at home, thanks for tuning in. TDM Talk Show will be back next week.